Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by World Anvil. In January 2021, The Office left Netflix after years of being a mainstay on the platform. If you're a regular viewer, you probably know that I've talked about that in the context of Netflix's issues a few times. Specifically, how they don't seem to be able to create the kind of long-running live-action sitcom, like Friends and The Office, that were once so huge on their own platform, with both consistently ranking as some of the most watched programs they had before they were removed. I guess at times I have been pretty hard on Netflix, but today I want to talk about the other side of the equation. How that move has impacted the viewership and legacy of The Office. Now, I'll admit this might seem like a weird topic at first. The Office is a show that ended 10 years ago this month, it's widely beloved, and its reputation has only grown with the general public since it ended. And also, frankly, it shows up in way too many dating profiles. So why do I really want to examine if it's fallen off in terms of popularity the past couple of years? Well, for a few reasons. One is that I find that the afterlife that shows take on can often be as interesting to me as the show's original runs themselves. Take a show like the original Star Trek, where it was the years of playing in syndication on local TV networks that turned the show from a well-liked but short-lived sci-fi program into an indelible TV landmark, and setting the stage for a long-running series of movies and even more shows. Or, to pick a more modern example, the shockingly long and vital life that Breaking Bad has had since it went off the air. As someone who was watching that show live in season 1 in 2008, I can confidently say that back then it really felt like no one but people who commented on the AV Club or Alan Sepinwall's reviews was really watching it. And the early ratings kind of bared that out. The Netflix bump was very real back then though, and by its final season, it was a pretty big hit. Still, even then it would have been hard to predict the second life that it would take on since. Where it seems like a week doesn't go by without like a new edit of Jesse and Walt in Mario Kart or something. And on the flip side of that coin, I think it's interesting to see shows that were really well regarded and popular in their day seem to fade from public consciousness a bit. Like Drew Gooden calling Lost the best show that no one talks about anymore. Or, to pick a Dwight Schrute classic, the excellent Battlestar Galactica reboot from the 2000s, which landed 19 Emmys, Time magazine called one of the best shows of all time, and was even popular enough to revolve an entire Portlandia sketch around in 2012. It was probably the defining show of the Sci-Fi Channel for almost a decade, but now it feels like it's kind of faded from the conversation entirely. I love both of those shows, and I don't think any less of them now, but I do find it pretty fascinating to track what sticks around in the forefront of the conversation and what doesn't.
You need to sell those in order to have a payday.
Which brings us back to The Office. The Office felt like it was more popular in 2019 or so than it did in 2013 when it wrapped up. Then the Peacock changeover hit. I wish I could give hard numbers here, I really do. Streaming services, as you may have heard from many a striking writer recently, tend to keep their viewership numbers under lock and key. But just doing some basic Google Trends tracking shows what you might have expected. In the last 5 years in the US, you see that The Office was holding fairly steady, with a big peak in late 2020 right before it moved, and then a pretty significant tumble. And you can see those trends recur in searches for character names like Michael Scott and Dwight Schrute. Worldwide, the numbers were a bit more steady across the line, but you can see a bit of an impact there as well. I'm not trying to just say that less people are probably watching The Office now that it's on a far less successful streaming service. That part is probably obvious. But to ask the question, is NBC Universal actively harming one of their most valuable crown jewels by using it to prop Peacock up? With a few years distance from that move now, I think it's worth asking how it's worked out for them. I don't have anything against Peacock, honestly. I'll even say that I really enjoyed Poker Face earlier this year. But there's no getting around that the service is really struggling. As of February this year, it had between 20 and 30 million subscribers, which obviously doesn't touch Netflix's numbers or come near HBO Max, which was at almost 100 million at the end of 2022. Even Paramount Plus, which at least in my head felt like it should have been comparable to, is blowing it out of the water, with that service having over 77 million subscribers. I've made videos in the past about how these platforms are struggling, but Peacock feels like it's on a whole other level. This was supposed to be the flagship streaming service of NBC Universal, and it's about on par with Apple TV Plus in terms of subscribers, a service with a fraction of its library. It's hard to know how many of those subscribers initially signed up for The Office, but I think it's safe to say that the hope that millions and millions would follow the show over to Peacock just hasn't panned out in the long run, even if it did cause a spike in subscribers back in 2021. Despite the show's help, Peacock is just failing to connect. NBC Universal paid $500 million to keep the streaming rights to The Office for 5 years. Assuming Peacock survives this long, it might move somewhere else starting in 2026. That's half a decade where one of the studio's most famous shows is on a struggling and relatively small streamer instead of the biggest one in the world. And it might mean that a move that looked smart in 2020 when everyone was racing to chase that Netflix model could instead seem like a disaster that cratered the popularity of a crown jewel show. And what should maybe be extra worrying to them is that it doesn't really seem to be happening to Friends, which is also a slightly older show. The same metrics on Google Trends shows that its move to HBO Max has left things more or less stable, with the big spikes coming from the show leaving Netflix and the cast reunion special on HBO Max. Now, I know Google Trends isn't the most advanced metric out there, and this is far from a hard numbers presentation. But just from Peacock's numbers alone, I think it feels pretty safe to assume that a lot less people in the US are watching The Office now than they were 3 years ago. And as that continues, I think we could see the show receding quite a bit, at least here, if not necessarily around the world. Now, in terms of continuing to watch and enjoy The Office, does any of this actually matter? Of course not. The show is still the show, and actually there's a case to be made that Peacock is a slightly better way to watch since they have the extended cuts of the episodes alongside the original NBC versions. But in terms of the show's lasting legacy, I do think it's a really interesting question. Like I said, Star Trek has lasted for decades in part because reruns of the show were made available to local TV stations at a cheap price, sending it into more homes in the 70s and 80s than it ever reached in the 60s. Obviously, things are really different now, but this almost feels like the exact opposite of that, with NBC Universal muffling the show and putting it in far fewer households than it was for nearly a decade on Netflix. Of course, even in the US, that's not factoring in other things that could keep The Office relevant and potentially attract newcomers. Clips from the show being all over YouTube and other video sites, physical media, Comedy Central, rewatch podcasts, even piracy. There's just a lot more ways to engage with the show after it leaves the air than back in the days of the original Star Trek. Still, The Office is the exact kind of show that really benefited from being easily accessible. It's easy to rewatch or have on in the background with an endless amount of episodes, especially by streaming standards. When that's taken away and suddenly there's a whole other streaming service you have to sign up for that experience, I think it's a much tougher sell. But I want to know how you all feel about this. Have you watched The Office much since it left Netflix? Do you think the move to Peacock is going to impact the legacy of the show in the long run? And how do you rank Peacock against the other streamers? I'll be reading it all down below. Some stories, like The Office, thrive on the mundane, and others are kind of the complete opposite of that, relying on massive, intricate worlds. If you like creating those, or spending time in them in games, I have the thing for you: World Anvil. This is a great resource for writers and creatives of all kinds, but especially for those working with role-playing games. Seriously, if you're a DM and want some help assembling the best possible campaign, this is a no-brainer, as it supports over 45 different game systems, from D&D to Conan to Star Wars and so many more. World Anvil really excels at the interactive organization of your world and story, with wiki-style presentations of your writing. One of their best features is the interactive maps, and using them with Chronicles, which allows you to organize a story across the time and space of your world. which means that laying out massive sci-fi or fantasy worlds has never been easier to do. Plus, it's just a lot of fun. Instead of endless messy notepads, you can organize cleanly, making it a breeze to connect the story threads how you see fit with text articles, art pieces, and your own elements. It also makes it easy to create magic systems, family trees, and get across exactly the tone your story requires. World Anvil is great whether you're designing a campaign, writing a novel, or whatever other form your sprawling epic might take. So head to the link in the description and use code MIDNIGHT to get 40% off the annual membership.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.